everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Jackie.
And it's me, Diana. Hi. I think I might start saying Diana Perry Cruz.
Why?
I like that.
And all my podcasts that I listen to say their first and their last name.
Oh.
And sometimes people don't know
You like Cher, though.
who I am and which one of us is married to you.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm Diana Perry Cruz. Hi.
Oh, okay. There you go.
I like to keep the mystery, so I'm just not going to give people my last name, and they can be like, are they a throuple or what?
It could be a throuple.
Oh, and it sounds like we've got an extra special guest on this podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and then discuss some relevant research articles. Or do we? Maybe we actually do a podcast about our favorite fall pies. But if I told you that, I'd be lying. And who better than to... It's going to sound... I started this transition to our special guest, Dr. Corey Stocco, but it was going to sound like who better to talk about lying than Dr. Corey Stocco. Is going to make it sound like some real ethical violations. And that's why we have you here. No, we have...
Smooth.
The worst liar out of all of us.
We have special guest, Dr. Corey Stocco, to talk about lying in a scientific research context, not due to any sort of particular ability that he is bringing to the show.
I've been known to be very honest.
How are you doing, Corey?
True. You have been known to be very honest.
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well, I would say. Enjoying life, loving the fall here in Minnesota.
Very nice. Is the fall there similar to, say, like New England fall, or is it a little more like cold faster?
No, it's pretty similar, I'd say, from my time in both places. I think maybe the main thing I saw is like New England reminds me a little bit of like northern Minnesota, where the trees are a little denser and you see more variation and stuff. It just depends on where you're at in the state, but it's pretty similar. I think a lot of people think Minnesota is just colder always.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's not necessarily the case.
Oh.
Okay.
We don't mind it that people think it's frigid here all the time because I think Prince said it keeps the bad people out or something.
There you go. When will you be able to use your porch as a fridge for beer?
Oh, probably next month.
Okay. Great. So in November. Okay.
Yeah.
That may be this month by the time our guests hear this.
Oh, good.
And it depends. Yeah. Who knows? November or December, maybe January. It can be.
All right. That's the
Fluctuate
same. Same for us. Yeah.
We could use an outdoor porch fridge. We were doing a pumpkin beer tasting with some folks, and it was too many pumpkin beers. They just make more every year. Most of them are not the greatest, but
For sure.
we got to try them all. But anyway, let's get on to our topic. We're going to be talking about lying, because this was, I saw a talk you did last year, and you started out in a way. I love when talks go this way. They don't always do this. Like sometimes I think it's like, I got to share all this good research and information. And you started out with this great anecdote that you shared about it. It was like your dad and like a trip you took, and it was great. And then, spoiler alert to your talk. Do you want to spoil it, Corey? It was your talk after all.
No, I was just happy that you remembered it, because that's part of the point of doing those kinds of things, is to make big ideas stick. It was some made up story about going to Massachusetts and visiting an uncle and going out to some, I think Mount Holyoke or something like that, and looking at the leaves and then using that analogy throughout to kind of make big points. But part of the story was completely made up. Yeah.
And again, it's like you said, it stuck with me. And then when you were and then you got into the research around lying and when is it okay to lie, not okay to lie. And it was an immediate.
So that was part of the talk, was when you told this story.
He lied.
Yes.
And then, okay.
He started with a lie.
Story I could hang main points off of. Yeah.
But it was great.
Well, that's just storytelling.
It was really good storytelling. Well, I think that Babbitt is where a lot of our episodes, certainly Corey, after that, I said, we got to get Corey on. We got to talk about lying. I love this. This is great. And I think we also did one episode on storytelling just as in a general fashion. And it came like there were a couple other folks that really, I think last year really nailed that idea. But you were certainly, I think the first talk I saw last year. So it was a great way to kick things off. And we're glad you could be here.
Here it is, only one short year later.
Well, I know how that goes. Yeah.
We're almost as slow as academia in that sense.
Yeah.
But so we're glad we can talk today a little bit about lying behavior and some research about lying. But before we get into the research itself, could you talk a little bit about yourself, kind of who you are, your background, and why this was a topic that you ever wanted to do, research on?
Sure. I guess professionally, who I am is sort of like these pieces of different people I've worked with. And when I was an undergrad, I happened to go to University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, and I was going to be a creative writer or something different.
I can see that. I can see that. I can see that. Yes.
And eventually I'd stumbled into psychology and I worked with Kevin Klatt and Dan Holt, were two behavior analysts at Eau Claire at the time. And I didn't know this, but they have a major now in behavior analysis, and it was an emphasis back there. So I just happened to land at a university that really had some good experiences in behavior analysis. And I started working with kids with autism and just kind of fell in love with the science of it and the objectivity of it, of not just are we trying to help people, but we're actually measuring things and evaluating things and analyzing things to see that we're actually helping. And then also some of those classes talked about things outside of developmental disabilities and autism. And that always kind of piqued my interest, I think, a little bit, of this idea that behavior analysis is a science that can be applicable across the board. And then I went on to graduate school, and that's where I met Jackie at the New England Center for Children. And I worked in the staff intensive unit there with some pretty severe behavior. So kind of shift from like early intervention to severe behavior, specifically with older kids. I worked with the oldest kids, I think, that are at the New England Center. And that was a whole different experience and kind of other end of the spectrum, so to speak, and got a lot more experience with severe behavior and staff management as well. Just how do we get people to do things consistently, and also embedding research into practice and the questions that we had. And while I was doing that, I got to work with Stacy Bancroft, was a really great supervisor, I guess, so to speak. And I worked with Jason Beret and Rachel Thompson in their labs, and we were doing all kinds of different things, some of which was kind of couched in the New England Center related to, at the time, Jason Beret was doing research on schedules of reinforcement and some stuff with like drugs as well, and psychotropic medications. And with Rachel Thompson, we were doing research on restricted interests and in autism, I think in particular. And simultaneously, Rachel was somebody I always wanted to work with because she's one of the researchers I admire so much in our field, because she has this ability to kind of go into any situation, go into any problem as a behavior analyst and find a research question and figure out a way to make things better in that context, might be a way I would put it. So I continued to work with Rachel, went on to my PhD program and worked with her and did some research in various areas. And my dissertation is kind of how I ended up in the area of lying, because I was always interested in Skinner's 1945 paper, The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms, and really talked about how we learn to talk about private events. And
I love that paper.
There was a point, me too, right? And there was a point where
I just want to say that Diana presented on that paper in our master's program, and that is why I actually understand it, which is hilarious.
I wonder if Diana had to do, so this is another person I think that had an influence. Bill Ahern used to teach his classes that way. Yeah. So that actually, so two things happened. There's kind of three things. It was Jason Beret, Bill Ahern, and then Rachel Thompson with that paper, where I used to have these like one-on-one meetings with Jason, and I don't remember what we were talking about, but at some point he said something about this paper, and I said, oh, I'd never heard of that. And he basically gave me the, like, you've never read Skinner's 19, like he gave me like a what kind of response. And then I went home and read it and had some other meetings set up with him and came back somewhat understanding it, but not fully understanding it. But then Bill's class, where we had to actually teach it, it made me understand it a little bit more. And then some of the feedback that Bill gave in class made me understand it a little bit more. And then somehow Rachel and I had been talking about it, and it led to these questions related to my dissertation that is on kind of an analog arrangement of if we reinforce responses based on public accompaniments, how accurate can people come to be about private events? So that kind of got me interested, I guess. Once I did that study, we were kind of thinking, well, I wanted to go into higher ed. And to be really honest, it was partly a thinking of how can I think about this in an applied context, because I need a job. And there's not a lot of jobs for some of the questions I was asking at the time. Most people want applied researchers in higher ed. And so I got interested in lying, and I started reading kind of as much as I could about it within behavior analysis and outside of behavior analysis. And the more I read, the more I realized some of the things I've been kind of sharing with our community, which is it's an area where I think there's a huge need for more behavior analysis, partly because I think it's sometimes one of those things that gets ignored if you're kind of focused just on developmental disabilities. And then also because it's one of those things that I think in my experiences, some behavior analysts think we've already kind of answered those questions. But when you look at the research, I don't see that. I think that there are still some gaps there. There might be some stuff that we think we know based on the existing research, but in terms of the evidence being there, it's not fully there. I'll stop there. I think that's how I got here.
Okay, so
there's a lot of talking from me.
So, Corey, how much of the story that you just told us is true?
Completely true.
Okay, good.
Fair enough.
true.
Okay.
Good.
No further questions.
So, Corey, one of the things that I know, and we'd read a couple articles on lying, and certainly, seeing your talk, that I come back to sometimes when I'm thinking about lying and the importance of studying lying, is sort of the sense of, well, lying just feels like one of those ubiquitous verbal behaviors. We all engage in some form of lying or other. A lot of times, I think when we talked about it previously on the show, we were really looking at it under the kind of auspices of we need to help some students learn when it is okay to lie. The little white lies, how does this make me look? You look nice, or like, hey, thanks for trying something new, right? Like, what do you say rather than the truth of like, ooh, that's the worst outfit anyone's ever worn. You shouldn't go out in public, right? And a lot of other times, I think when we see lying behavior, especially as, it's more in the context of these like transgressions. And when there's serious enough transgressions, there's ways to get evidence to prove that like you actually did commit the crime. And with young children, it's one of those sort of like, well, every child lies at some point, and then they kind of grow out of it because they want to be honest and good citizens. So when you think of lying, and certainly looking at these articles, I mean, do you see it as like it is an important transgression, and maybe we do undervalue how important teaching children to avoid or engage in honest truth-telling behavior is? Or do you sometimes wonder like, yeah, it is kind of one of those, everybody does it, so as long as we all take what we say with a grain of salt, we can move on in our lives? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. There's some research on these kinds of questions. I mean, generally speaking, the scientific evidence suggests most everyone cares to some extent. And I think, speaking kind of colloquially about it, I think a lot of it is when we talk about trusting someone, telling the truth is part of that. Or in other words, in our field, we have some research on do say or say do correspondence, where you say what you mean, you do what you say, so to speak. And I think that can matter in terms of social interactions and quality of relationships. And there's some research to suggest that kids who lie more to their parents, there's a correlation between how much they lie and then how much those parents rate their kind of satisfaction with the relationship with their kid. And that's probably true. I haven't seen the research or if there even is any. I mean, just in friendships, I think in our lives, we probably don't hang out with the people that lie to us a lot. So there's something about trust, I think, colloquially, and I think that has to do with do say or say do correspondence that can matter. I think it obviously, sort of what you're saying, Rob, or related to it, is it depends on the relationship, right? There's contexts where I will very quickly lie just to escape a social situation, probably, and not really think much of it, and maybe even think it's a socially valid way to do that in that context. I think about situations at work where it's not a big deal. It's more of a social situation where you're just having small talk with somebody and maybe saying something, and it gets out of the conversation a little quicker and you get back to your tasks or something like that. Or if somebody, gives me a gift, depending on the person. My grandma gave me terrible gifts and I was always honest with her. But I've had friends, who I don't know very well, who maybe gave me a gift and thought I would like it. And I tell them how much I love it or something like that.
Sure.
But anyhow, I think it depends in terms of who cares about it. I think we all care about it to some extent. And it probably just depends on who it is that's telling the truth or lying to us that can really have an impact. And I think those of us who are parents or our teachers who interact with kids on a regular basis, it is a meaningful thing. And I think it becomes a more meaningful thing as you get into context where you want to know something about something that happened when you weren't around. And really the best you got is what that person has to say. And under those contexts, I think people care about it very much. When you have little to no control over the doing, so to speak, you're going to rely more on the saying. And if people are lying to you a lot in that context, that can be very meaningful. Relatedly, actually, Rob, you and I were talking about working in schools. It matters to me a lot that my teachers, I work as a school-based behavior analyst now, I want them to be honest with me about everything. Mm-hmm. If there's something that they didn't do right, so to speak, I want them to feel comfortable telling me about it so that we can talk about it if I wasn't there, right? So I think that's part of the context that's important, is when you're really relying on somebody else's report of an event and there's some kind of meaningful aspect of that relationship, that can be a big deal.
So before we get a little bit more into the discussion of lying and the context in which lying occurs, doesn't occur, Diana, do you mind sharing what are the articles that we'll be discussing today?
Once again, I'm surprised by this question that I'm asked every
almost forgot to ask.
Episode. Well, as I'm pulling this up, go ahead.
You actually were surprised because you were like,
yeah.
oh,
yeah. Well, I was already thinking, these conversations that we're having are really important, and certainly, there are going to be different functions for lying and reasons why it's adaptive in different areas. And I love what you said about trust. So if there is trust established within a relationship, then you're hopefully less likely to see lying behavior. But we can't forget that there are folks who are in situations in which it's a necessity to lie to protect themselves, right? So those are not the situations that we're going to be covering in this episode. There would be a whole different area or body of research to understand, right? Like when it may be protective to lie and what one should do in the larger sense in that scenario. But the ones that we're going to talk about today are, I think most people are going to be in agreement that yes, we don't want cheating and we don't want stealing and then lying about it, right? Like those are the kinds of things that we're covering here. So my thoughts were in that area rather than on the titles of these articles. But I can actually tell you what the titles of these articles are now. And they are Further Evaluations of Contingencies on Lying About Homework Completion. That was written by Stocco, Malign, and Bauer, published in Behavioral Interventions 2021. Also, Increasing Young Children's Honest Reports and Decreasing Their Transgressions by Lahardy, Lazensky, Stocco, Fallon, and Rodriguez. That was published in JABA 2022.
Okay. So like you were saying, Corey, the focus we're going to be doing kind of that say-do correspondence with children. If an adult's not there, do they engage in the behavior that they said they did? And in a situation where the behavior that they could engage in is potentially, I don't want to say dangerous, but we're mostly focusing on cheating, playing with things you shouldn't be, touching things you shouldn't be touching. So those are the types of lying behaviors and contexts that we'll be discussing. No social nicety lying.
That's right. Largely been, I think, the focus of what I've honed in on. Partly because, so it's not just the lying that's the concern. It's the things that are lied about that are also meaningful and specifically in contexts where you might not be able to do much about the thing that the person's doing is somewhat of what I'm interested in.
So I was kind of surprised in both articles, the discussion of kind of say-do correspondence lying, that kind of inaccurate reporting type lying, that when talking about sort of, parenting experts and, this is something that is very concerning to parents, it felt like the common sense treatment for lying was the same as it had been 500 years ago in terms of let's read the story about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree.
It's not 500 years old.
I know. I was lying about the time frame there. I was hyper, and it seemed like there's got to be a more relevant historical or fictionally historical event that would make up the social story that is in the lying, parenting handbook. I mean, was that just you were using that as an example, or is that literally nope? That's the one everyone comes up with. And
I mean, I think so. In terms of like parenting experts and what's out there, it depends. Largely speaking, there are non-behavioral folks that have a fair amount of space to share what they think, and then there are some behavioral folks, whether they're behavior analytic or not. There are some developmental psychologists who understand, at the very least, the importance of direct measures of behavior, and they have things to say as well. So I think in terms of like what people have to say from experts, it really depends on where you're going. I've seen very different things on one hand and compared to another, and what they cite as sort of evidence, or if they even cite evidence, those are wildly different. I think largely what I see, I mean, the story, the George Washington story is a specific thing that we focused on in some previous research because it was out there from some parenting experts and cited at least one specific study. What I see largely is like a lot of antecedent strategies. So like read stories to your kids about how telling the truth is important, or the way you ask a kid if they're telling, about an event in general. Did you brush your teeth? How you ask matters. If you say, did you brush your teeth? You better tell me the truth. You're in big trouble, versus did you brush your teeth? Be honest with me. Good things happen, so to speak. Modeling of telling the truth. A lot of sort of antecedent strategies. And when you look at the studies that also support them, they generally are looking at sort of just antecedent effects in brief moments and statistically significant differences. There is some research, I think, that highlight the importance of consequences, but the evidence behind it is pretty lacking. And that's sort of like where we were going, I think, as a lab, was we need to evaluate some of these things. Some of them make intuitive sense, or not intuitive sense, empirical sense, based on what we know about differential reinforcement, things like that. But I think the question with, say, a more under the dome population and what functions as reinforcement, that is an interesting question to me. How do we do these things? So if the general idea is reinforce honesty, that's essentially what our community would say. How you do that, I think, is what's really interesting to me. What could function as reinforcement? What are people willing to use as reinforcement in terms of social validity? To be frank, I became a little less interested in things outside of our field as I went on, even though there's sort of more of it, because I saw all of the pitfalls in the research. And I guess what I'm trying to say about experts is I don't know what I would believe at this point. I think the evidence that's put there to support some of it could maybe it would be effective in given context, but the evidence that's there is pretty weak. Is the way I would phrase it.
Yeah.
I just want to say that my kids have a total tell when they're lying if I ask them if they brush their teeth. It's like a certain way that they say, yeah.
Yes.
They won't make eye contact. And they like real quick, just offhandedly, yeah. Like if you didn't, just go do it now. You don't have to lie.
Yes. Yep.
So I don't know if anyone's done that research, but I'll save it for dissemination station.
The toothbrush.
So people outside of our field have, like, they call them Pinocchio responses. Like any Pinocchio responses.
Absolutely.
And I mean, the research was sort of, the conclusion was, no, there aren't any consistent ones, but.
Oh, I think you have to know your own kid, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I think that research is lacking in terms of rigor of reliability and validity and things like that.
Mm-hmm. I just want you to know that I have one. So.
You tell?
Yeah. I have a total tell. I am not a good liar.
Hands?
I'm like, yeah. I'm like,
Oh,
Yeah.
Your nose is growing. What is it, Jackie? I don't know. What is it?
I'm not going
Can
to
you tell us?
No.
Oh. I'll work
pay
on it. I'm gonna figure it out.
But I do it every time I lie. Every single time. And I know I'm doing it. I'm like,
All right.
bro.
Oh,
Yeah. Everyone will have to await follow-up on that.
I don't really lie to you, though, Dinah. I think it's going to be hard for
No, of course you don't.
you. You look great.
Friends usually don't.
Thanks so much. So do you.
so Corey, your article where you were primary author was an extension of an article by Souter et al. in 2020. And I always love a good extension study because unlike movies, when you get the sequel article, it's like, oh, I can just read the sequel and it's going to be better than the last one because it built on all the things we loved about that research and more questions were answered. So always appreciate that.
I feel like this one did require reading in the previous one though, because they were like, see appendix in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, you did a good job. You know what? I'm not going to study lying behavior. I'm not going to lie and say I'm going to read every article there is. So I always love a good extension with a great summary of what came before. It's a good way to save time. Pro tip for behavior analysts who say I don't have enough time to read all the research. You're right. You don't. Here, find the extension articles.
Yeah.
But when you kind of developed it, what could you talk a little bit about sort of what were the big questions that you read that article and said, this isn't answering everything, or they noted limitations, I'm sure, and how you wanted to capture them in the makeup of your study?
Oh boy, I have a long part one to this answer, and then I promise we'll get back to it. I think the big challenge, or maybe my main criticism of behavior analytic research in this area, is I don't think we have very good assessments of lying or measures of lying. Let's just say, I'll phrase it a few different ways. We really don't have, I think, a lot of empirical arrangements that have construct validity, social validity, all the different types of validity that basically somebody else would, agree, or the empirical evidence would agree that this is a consistent way to measure meaningful aspects of lying. So there's a lot of research under the sort of umbrella of correspondence training or the correspondence literature. And this is what I was alluding to before, where I think in our field, I've heard kind of some things where people say, well, we've already answered this question. And maybe that's true, but there's a lot of leaps from what we have to what most people would say is a robust literature on lying. Capturing lying in an empirical way is tricky. And so a good chunk of what we were trying to do was move towards that. If you look at the correspondence literature, there's kind of two main issues. I think sometimes they're looking at, do say correspondence or say do correspondence. And if you look at those contexts, you wouldn't say that those are meaningful aspects of socially valid, at least, aspects of lying. So there's some really great studies that look at if a kid will accurately report toys they played with, or if they promise to go play with the toy, if they play with it or not, and looking at the extent to which their promises match what they did, or if they did something, if they accurately report what they did. Those studies are neat, but whether they actually tell us anything about lying in meaningful context is an empirical question, and we don't really have answers to those questions right now. So that's kind of one issue. The other aspect, if you look at the correspondence literature, is a good chunk of it, even though they'll talk about, say, correspondence training, that correspondence training increased correspondence. If you look at those studies, they only measure the doing components. You actually don't know anything about correspondence just from the study alone, so to speak. So part of our mission was that, just like, can we arrange a context where we can actually capture people lying consistently? And that was an issue we had in the Sauter paper. Mm-hmm. It was one of the first studies we tried to do. I admire Jessica Sauter a lot for doing that as a master's thesis. And we didn't capture lying right away in that study, just in the baseline procedures, so to speak. So that was one aspect of just trying to get an arrangement where can we get people to engage in some kind of transgression without having to do anything super wonky, and also capture lying consistently in a way that we can, look at how they're doing this in a single case design with repeated measures, and then also evaluate some kind of realistic intervention.
What you have to do, Corey, is just put baby carrots in a Cheetos bag. And then you can be like, are you eating Cheetos?
Gross. Anyhow, so I'm just thinking about the disappointment of
I know, right?
baby carrot when you think you're getting a Cheeto. Anyhow, that was one aspect of it. And then asking maybe a larger question. So in the Stocco et al. 2021 paper, Adam Aline was a graduate student of mine, and he and I talked about, various kind of next steps. And so whereas Sauter kind of asked a very small question, which is, if we read the George Washington story, do we get any kind of impact in a context where there's still reinforcement for lying? Because I think that that's a relevant question to ask in terms of what I had mentioned before. A lot of parenting experts really emphasize the antecedent strategies, but whether those antecedent strategies actually match the consequences is a whole nother thing. So Adam Aline's thesis focused more on, all right, what if we take all of these things that have been recommended by experts and create a package intervention? And basically the package is like praise for telling the truth is good. And so we read the George Washington story, the way we asked questions about how they did on the math assignments, which is what the context was. That alluded to, hey, if you tell the truth, good things happen kind of thing. And then programmed praise as well, even though nobody encountered it. How does that work to begin with? So we kind of kept moving in the direction of what are the things that are out there and can we just test them? And that study in particular kind of looked at, all right, let's package a bunch of it together. And we called it just like a praise-based intervention, because that's one of the most probably widely suggested interventions within our field too. And I have some skepticism about it just because the things that people lie about oftentimes are transgressions, right? So you did something wrong. And what you're kind of banking on is that praise alone might override reinforcement for lying. And I guess maybe a context I've thought about, but maybe never written about is like being like a teenager. And I don't know, your parents might ask you about things when you're a preteen or a teenager that are kind of uncomfortable, right? Like they might want to know if you're drinking or doing drugs or your sexual activity even, right? And if you tell the truth, you might get praise, but it also might open the door to more conversation about those things. And I think there's some of us, maybe all of us, I don't know, the escape from that situation might be so powerful that whatever praise you throw on for telling the truth doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So I'm generally interested in that idea early on about praise as reinforcement for telling the truth, because we've even had some other studies in our field that have come up about praise, and we've kind of learned it doesn't work as well as we think it does, most likely. There's I think it was Andy Harper's dissertation from KU that showed that with preschoolers. It might be misremembering, but it depends is the answer, right? And so these kind of broad sweeping suggestions, this is another reason why I think behavior analysts should do more work here, is I think we'd find more of the idiosyncrasies. The broad sweeping suggestions about, basically, reward or reinforce telling the truth and specifically focus on praising telling the truth. I don't know. I'm curious about the conditions under which that works and when it doesn't work. And it might depend on your history with that person. It might depend on the specific context in which it's happening. There's a lot of variables that I think could impact the potential efficacy and effectiveness of that suggestion.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everyone, sorry to interrupt the conversation, but I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track...
No, you're not. You're lying.
I'm lying. Well, I mean, I do want to remind listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening to the show, you can earn 1 learning credit. All you'll need are 2 special guest code words from Dr. Corey Stocco. And the first one is Minnesota. Minnesota. It's one of the 50 nifty United States. And as we learned from Corey, it is not always icy. It's not always covered in snow. But don't tell everyone, because I think, keeps the land values really, really good. If not, everyone rushes out there at once.
We can't have that.
Can't have that, no. Minnesota. All right. And now back to the show. Could you speak a little more to, the situations or the context in your study that the participants found themselves in? The impossible math quiz with the answers available. They got the self-grade.
Is that what they're calling new math now? Impossible math?
Well, we specifically
look at some of these math,
we did some assessment of understanding where people's math levels were at, and sort of the idea, the experimental manipulation was to give them math that they would likely not be able to do based on that assessment. So you're putting them in a situation where they would struggle or don't know the answers, but they had access to the answer key, which I think can happen. There are situations where even being in higher ed, I know some people that have accidentally printed the test with the answer key before. That has happened. And sometimes students honestly report, you gave me the answer key. Anyhow,
teacher, you forgot to tell us about our homework for the weekend.
Yeah. So it was a context where they had math that should be too difficult for them, but they also had access to the answer key, but they were specifically instructed to look at the answer key at the end to check their answers. And so the transgression, the rule breaking in the context was peeking at the answer key beforehand. And the way that we experimentally verified that they were peeking is we put the wrong answers in the answer key. So if they wrote the wrong answer, but it was the one that matched the answer key, then we counted that as a lie.
That's clever.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, Adam Lean and I talked about that a lot. And I think that was his idea after we talked about a few different ones. So
what I used to do to the kids who would cheat off of me in class.
Put the wrong answer in something.
And then when they turned their test in, I would erase it and put my answers.
Yeah. You were actually lying as well.
I was a total narc.
Yeah.
It's entrapment.
Yeah. So I think that's the gist. And then afterward, they reported how many math answers they got correct. Mm-hmm. And then we calculated the likely honest reports, basically.
So
that's clever.
When you started the study, because sort of the way it reads is, just like any research paper, it's sort of, here's this part of the paper and this part, which doesn't always necessarily capture. This is what we were trying to do from minute one. Yeah. But, that's not the story we have to tell in the story of the research. Yeah. The focus was sort of on the honest reporting. But then you bring up the good point of, I think it was some of the parents, and I think this came up again in the Lahardy study of if you continue to be honest, and you're just honest about how you are continually breaking the rules, does anyone care about that brand of honesty? Yes, I did. I cheated all the time, and I'm going to keep doing it in this math situation. Was that something that you'd thought might happen, or was that something that as you were doing the study and you noticed the patterns of the participants that you suddenly were concerned or were thinking more about of like, oh, we've set up a contingency that promotes honesty, but honesty does not necessarily equal socially acceptable patterns of behavior.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to be a researcher in an area like this at times, because you're sort of trying to stick to research questions that extend the existing literature while also having a good chunk of anecdotal experience that's happening. And there's maybe a part of you that wants to jump to the anecdotal questions, but we were really trying to ask questions that were like next logical extension. Let's see what happens and capture it versus just assume that these problems could happen. And so, yeah, there's a component of that study where once we find an intervention that teaches the kid to be honest about cheating at math, we had a parent that went in and implemented the differential reinforcement procedure. And she was barking. She said, I don't like this. I don't like that he just keeps coming and telling you or telling me that he's cheating. He's still cheating. And we're just giving him rewards for that. And so it also came from everyday life. I have a good friend, Kevin Lazinski, and in our field, and we had been talking about this stuff early on. He had young kids, and he would ask me questions about what I thought based on what I knew about the literature. And I would suggest, like, all right, your kid's lying. Here's what I think maybe would happen. Don't quote me on it, but here's what I think could work. And his son was reinforcing telling the truth like crazy. And his son would come up and tell him the truth about stuff he did. And I think the example that he told me about when he was really getting frustrated was his son was having accidents. And so his son had peed on the floor, and he came up to his dad, Kevin, and just smiled at him. He's like, Dad, I peed on the floor. And Kevin was not psyched about it. I think especially the smiling part. And so I had kind of thought that something like this would happen. That was sort of the anecdotal experience. But largely speaking, at that point, I guess going back to the living in the research realm, that is largely what our field has to say about interventions for lying is reinforce telling the truth. And that's about it. And there's not a lot of research on, again, like I'd mentioned before, how do you do that? And how do you do it in socially valid ways? And so I think that that's a big area of need is how can we do that? In a way that people will say, thank you, please come help me, and thank you, you solved my problem.
It reminds me so much of I think it's Glenn Latham's Power of Positive Parenting, which is a book we talked about on the show.
Yes.
I love that book. But when you get to the teenagers, and we're getting to the point where we have an older son who's at the age where this situation it's not just an academic discussion of, you're setting up these contingencies where honesty and, even though you don't have to agree with everything your teen does, you want to make sure they feel safe with you. So that situation of they're at a party and something really bad is happening, or they realize that they are too drunk to drive home, that they call you so that you pick them up. And it always does feel like, step one, make sure you've created the honest situation. Step two, praise them and be kind that they called you so that you could pick them up. Step three, I guess, punish them as well, and then hope that that's the only time this ever happens so that the next time they'll call you again. Yeah. And it always does feel like there's that real disconnect between honest behavior and appropriately, consequating, less socially appropriate behavior. Well, I guess socially appropriate if you're a teenager to be doing that stuff sometimes, but less valuable, we would say, as parents' behavior, while still maintaining honesty and an increase in sort of the resistant behaviors that you want your teen to have. And so I definitely was thinking about that in reading both of these articles, sort of the dichotomy at play. Even though I think most of us think of honesty as it's one big ball of, if you're honest, you therefore do the right thing all the time. In which case, why would you need to be honest? Because you're doing the thing everyone wants you to do anyway.
So I mean, that to me is the golden question. And that Robert Laharty's dissertation was a step in that direction. But as far as I know, it's the only study that really directly captures those behaviors and the effects of intervention. There's one study, I'm drawing a blank on the first authors, but from the Triple P Positive Parenting Program, they have some study that supposedly supports the effects of the Triple P program on lying about things, transgressions in particular. But all the measures are indirect. They're all just parent reports of lying. And it's if you look deep at it, I admire the researchers for doing it because it's a really tricky thing to even do to begin with. But in terms of, again, sort of like quality of evidence in our field, and if we say like we have solved this problem, I wouldn't point to that study because of the limitations. I wouldn't point to ours either because there's limitations. Like there's a lot more research to do in this area to really say that we have good answers that are reliable, valid, and ultimately going to be useful.
Well, looking at the Lahardy study, with the switch to, so instead of the math problems, you had children who through preference assessment identified, the favorite toys were identified, and you get the, now don't touch these toys, I got to take a phone call, play, and sometimes you did tell them to play with other toys. Or
they were referred to the study because they had a history of taking things that did not belong to them and lying about it.
Their lying was different. Yeah. But I mean, Corey, should we be thinking about like the mechanisms of lying in that context as being different than, say, in the math context? I mean, is it still just the same say, do say kind of correspondence we're talking about? Or, I mean, are there other mechanisms at play that even should be being discussed?
I mean, I think there could be, if I'm following you. I think it's very possible and very likely that we have very different histories for inaccurate reports that we might call lies versus inaccurate reports that are due to something else. Inaccurate reports due to speaking loosely, not knowing, so to speak, which has to do with histories related to I think, verbal behavior and probably specifically tax and intraverbals and delayed responses to events and all that kind of side, delayed matching to sample, any of that kind of stuff could all be relevant, I think. So there's sort of a difference, I think, most likely in that, and whether they're transferable or generalizable, I think is an empirical question that I don't know of a study that has ever done that. I mean, said differently, if you do sort of a do-say correspondence study that is on something that's not a socially significant lie, what toy did you play with? Playing with any of the toys would have been fine. Mm-hmm. And we get kids to be more accurate. Does that tend to then transfer to contexts where kids are being asked about committing transgressions? I don't know. I think it's probably likely that it's different. And I think it's probably different in the sense of their history of lying or telling the truth in that context is probably very different. The way that caregivers behave in those contexts is probably very different. So I would be kind of surprised if we see some generalization across those kind of contexts, the sort of safe, easy question, or maybe another way of putting it is sort of, it's not exact, but, sort of like the Miltenberger BST situations, then in situ questions, those even more closely match, I think. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we would see the same effects, so to speak, if you did sort of a study, assess levels of correspondence, got correspondence high in a more contrived low stakes environment, and then tested the more high stakes, now you're asking your teenage kid about doing drugs and if they're sexually active and things like that. I would guess it's very different.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That's another area I really hope more people are doing research and asking those questions rather than just going off of our scientific interpretations, because I think there are ways of answering those questions.
It seems hard. It seems hard to do that. I'm like trying to conceptualize how as you're talking, I'm like, how would I set this study up? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, you couldn't.
Well, I think.
Yeah, you can't address that question. Be like, are you sexually active? Right? Because then.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just like.
Well, I think with young kids, it's probably a little less. The stakes are probably a little lower.
But that's not where it's most important, right? I'm thinking about teenagers. Like if we wanted to do the research as like with teenagers.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, at the very least, it could be like, I think of like the good behavior game. There's a good chunk of research on the good behavior game with young kids. And then there's some longitudinal work on the effects of good behavior game and how predictive of future success that is. If we had research on that, like if you think about correspondence training in that regard is more of like a preventative approach with young kids. Okay. Maybe there could be some longitudinal studies then that are predictive of some degree of correspondence later in life, and maybe some additional measures of people reporting on, quality of relationships with their kids and things like that.
We might, if we're going to use the good behavior game for like teenagers, we're going to have to think of a way cooler name.
They call it the game.
The game.
It's a game. Okay. But it's got to be
one of the articles. Which didn't sound cool to me. I was like, who?
Right, it's got to be even cooler. We got to
like about lying behavior from teenagers. Like, yeah, prof, that's a great name for
yeah, we gotta be more thoughtful about this. So this is what I'm going to
Skibbity game.
Skibbity
game? Skibbity.
Yeah.
I'm going to...
I may have just sworn. I'm not actually sure.
Oh, I'm going to... This is going to be my shower thoughts for the next week. I'll get back to you, Corey.
On the good behavior game and what to call it for teenagers?
Yeah, and then we could because let's think about the teenagers that didn't have great correspondence as young kids, right? And then how do we promote non-lying in them, right? You say like, okay, it's predictive across the lifespan, but what can we do like right now, teenager-wise? So, I don't know.
And I think that's one of there's not a lot of research on that question. No. I mean, in terms of like, let's say behavioral interventions for lying with teenagers.
Yeah.
There's not a ton. There's some from the correspondence literature.
Right.
And I mean, I think you're usually relying on events that are verifiable to begin with, that the people are reporting on, or that have highly correlated accompaniments of some kind. You know, it's something that happened and you can go check. I think of like my son when he brushes his teeth, or he says he brushes his teeth. I usually go check, if I know where the toothpaste was and the toothbrush was, and if the sink is wet, and I look for like all these things that are pretty highly correlated with like if you did it or not.
I'm just thinking about, you're like, did you have relations with your lady friend today? And you're like, yep. Like, no. And you're like, all right, I'm going into your bedroom.
Right. Oh, no.
Yeah, no, probably.
No way. Yeah. I tried to use that trick, Corey, and I was like, well, you didn't brush your teeth because your toothbrush is not wet. And then they went in the bathroom and said, well, that's not my toothbrush. This one's my toothbrush. And then the other brother came in and said, no, that's my toothbrush. And they have both been using the same toothbrush. Yeah. So you also got to watch out for that.
That's a different problem, though. That's a hygiene problem, not a lying problem. Or say do.
That's the trick. Like if you're relying on those correlates, then I mean, as kids get older, they can develop really creative repertoires with respect to that, right? I mean, they
it was an accident. They didn't.
Like you said, it could be. You might just create more creative lying in the sense of like, oh, I got an answer for that one too, right?
That's true. That is.
It's a tricky. Again, lots of research to do here because I think that the answers that we have are incomplete, and there's a lot of like under what conditions.
Oh, for sure. And you lie to your parents for different reasons than you lie to your friends or your teachers, right? Often I think it's a avoidant behavior, but perhaps not always. Sometimes you lie to gain things too. There's so many factors involved.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's oftentimes a escape component, escape from some kind of social context. And like you said, for different reasons, there's certain things that I'd be more likely to lie to my parents or grandparents about to escape the social situation than I would with my friends. There's things I would tell my friends that I wouldn't tell my parents. And I think it has a lot to do with conditioned establishing operations.
And trust, absolutely.
People ask you about things.
That piece of trust is super important. So I would imagine that the more you've had opportunity to practice when they're young, saying, you tell me the truth and we'll work through this together, right? I'd rather know the truth than not. That as they age, they will continue to be more likely to tell you the truth. But I don't know. I don't really know if that research is out there.
No, not really. I would say I think that's a really common thing that is said, that, the importance of establishing it at a young age. And it makes good sense behaviorally. But whether that, like, how preventative is it, I think, is a question, because I think it's still lying or telling the truth is still largely a conditional discrimination, a pretty complex conditional discrimination that, depending on my interactions with that person, could lead things on versus how I still continue to behave with another person. So if one person asks me a question and the way they respond functions as punishment, I'm probably more likely to lie to them in the future if I can escape that response. And I think if there's people that know how to reinforce telling the truth, it's probably more likely that you're more honest with those people. And we probably all have those people to some extent. There's probably some people in our lives that we are just pretty consistently honest with. But I don't know about the extent to which people are like, truthful with everyone or anything like that.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think when we talk about lying as a problem behavior, it sort of corresponds to, I think, some of the work that Lahardy added into that group's kind of the package intervention. So it wasn't just about the say do correspondence. It was also about engaging in alternative behavior, resisting the temptation or resisting the repetitive stimuli of those highly preferred toys by engaging in other behavior. And then part of the consequence being, I wish you told the truth. And now we're going to play with these other toys. I'm going to practice what you should have done instead before you access the activity and the reinforcer that you really want. Kind of reminds me of some of if you read like Walden too, the idea of we need to teach kids slowly how to handle these tough situations in life. So is it really a lying intervention so much as engaging in tough behavior so you don't have a context where lying is required skill? It almost seems like sidestep lying, work on being honest and engaging in these other behaviors so that you never put yourself in a situation where lying might have there might be a motivation to lie. Though again, we talked about a lot of contexts where that is not always going to be the case, maybe for cheating on math, but not necessarily for social lies or, disengagement from a social situation where you use a lie to get out of it and it doesn't hurt anyone.
Yeah. I think I think I'm picking up what you're putting down there, Rob. I think that's another research question, which is, a nice extension of the Lahardy paper might be, well, all right, hold on. One of the main effects of the Lahardy paper is, all right, we can teach kids sequentially to be more honest. And then once we get them to be more honest about the transgression, we can decrease the transgressions. And what came along for the ride there is the social validity assessments from parents, as they said, we're pretty happy about the telling the truth, but we're still not satisfied until we also reduce transgressions. That would be probably the way I'd put it, right?
Yeah.
So they weren't really happy until we addressed both. It would be curious if a study could compare basically one of two ways approaching, because usually parents are reporting about lies that are concerning that are about transgressions. So a simple comparison maybe could be, do we do this? Is the sequential thing important? Do you need to get kids to be more honest and then decrease the transgressions? Or I think oftentimes what behavior analysts are probably doing is just dealing with the transgressions. And so does it matter or not, I think is somewhat the question that has kind of been a unifying theme of a few things we've talked about here, where it's sprinkled up of do we even need to spend this time trying to get kids to tell the truth about transgressions? Or should we just go right to the transgressions and get those under control? It's been a question when I've done some consulting in these areas that I usually ask a question like that pretty early on of, well, what do you care about? Do you want the kid to be telling the truth, or do you just want to deal with what they're lying about? And sometimes parents say just the thing they're lying about. And I say, okay, well, let's focus on that. No need for doing this kind of sequential thing then.
Right. Yeah.
And what those contexts are, I don't know yet. I think that's a neat area of research too, is trying to understand a little bit more of the social validity of these phenomena to begin with.
Yeah. This feels like a good segue into the dissemination station. We talk about the big ideas. Oh boy, which we've kind of already started doing. Sometimes that happens, Corey. Sometimes we're talk about the research and then boom, break, talk about. But I feel like
you don't go to dissemination station. Dissemination station comes to you.
Oh man, if you stare too long into the dissemination station stares back at you. Wow.
Creepy.
So I think we sort of talked about some kind of next steps, and I love the idea. And if anyone's listening and they're like, I want to work on a dissertation topic, maybe they want to get right to that extension of Lahardy with young children, and then do your longitudinal study, and you'll see in 10 years we'll have you on the show if we're still doing it.
Dissertation's done in 10 years.
Yeah, you're never going to graduate, but we need to know.
Yeah. No, I think there's a ton. Hold on, can I chime in on?
Of course you can. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's your job.
I think
that's what you're here to help us with.
I think. I would really encourage anybody who's interested. I really think there's lifetimes of work in this area. And I really think there needs to be more behavior analytic research specifically in this area, partly going back to some of the points I had mentioned before about, outside of behavior analysis, psychologists usually use research methods that don't really answer these questions well, to be honest. Still admire them for doing it, but usually they're using null hypothesis significance testing. And there are many issues with that. That is not even just me as a behavior analyst trying to be rah single case design, but even outside of our field, people have been critiquing that framework for a long time. And I think some of it is just at the heart of it. Null hypothesis significance testing didn't originate in psychology. It originated in agriculture when they were comparing effects of like fertilizer across crops. Well, you can keep crop fields the same. So one of the main issues is that there's foundational assumptions from the onset that are violated in psychology. We never have two groups of people that are the same. Mm-hmm. Even if you can measure it and kind of be like, well, there's no statistically significant difference between these groups. There's a difference, no doubt. And the null hypothesis assumes there's no difference. So right away, that framework is completely violated. There's always a difference in terms of the comparisons that are being made when you're dealing with humans. And statisticians would tell you this too, that you're using a framework that doesn't make any sense given the phenomena you're studying. And then aside from that, there's all kinds of issues with p-hacking that folks may or may not know about, where it just can be very hard when you're doing a study and it takes many years. You might do some things to try and make sure you get a statistically significant difference. And I think usually those things involve continuing to recruit participants until you get, like, you see a difference, but it's not statistically significant. And you go, I'll get like 5 more people. And then eventually you get a statistically significant difference, or you run different statistical analyses and then you get a statistically significant difference. And ultimately, a lot of the research that's out there that's speaking to, like we talked about experts before, it's not behavior analysts, it's people that are using that framework. And I think when it comes down to it, some of the main issues is that statistical significance is emphasized so much in the absence of what really important scientific criteria are, which, like direct measures. Oftentimes there's indirect measures in some of those studies, or just reliability. Sometimes those studies are brief little 5-minute glimpses. They do some kind of antecedent manipulation, see some kind of changes across groups and make comparisons, but it's one little measure of 5 minutes of observation. So there's nothing about the reliability of that effect over time. And then in terms of validity, some of these studies have statistically significant outcomes, but there's no internal validity, meaning there's alternative explanations, or there's issues with external validity too, which there always is with null hypothesis significance testing, because at the very least, you can never generalize the effects down to the individual level. And so to me, my main point, I guess, there is that single case design is especially useful when we're asking these kinds of questions about socially significant problems and the reliability and validity of those effects. So I guess my dissemination station point is there is a huge need for more single case research to begin with. And it might appear as if you're a behavior analyst and you go look to the literature, there are experts making statements and they'll cite studies. But if you go look at those studies, I will guarantee you that they fall short of what we want in terms of evidence that supports meaningful changes in people's lives.
I'm always surprised, especially in the area of lying, Corey, there's so many questions. You brought up so many like really strong ones of like, well, could we study it this way? Could we study it that way? But we do not know the answer. And I think even with that, we also then have the actual environment in which we live that isn't being controlled for in all of these studies. Maybe if you were doing a study that utilized, longitudinal work, or you looked at lots of different groups, because there are environments where honesty is never going to be reinforced. And to have these rules about this is how you create honest behavior and decrease transgressions, you may just be setting up these false situations. Even if you do a good study where you really are trying to control for the environment, well, that's not going to be the environment forever. Or maybe that's not the environment outside of your experimental design. There are so many places where honesty is not valued. And I don't think we're just talking like, well, in prison, they don't value honesty. Snitches get stitches. I think, most people's homes, honesty is not 100% valued behavior. Yeah. Because there are times when not lying is going to lead to a worse outcome, regardless of how much your parents are trying to teach you honesty. And some of those environmental factors are, I think, going to be very hard to study, even, with all these other things we have to learn about lying and context for lying.
For sure.
Yeah. I don't know. That's not like a question. That's
Corey
just
does not know how to follow that up.
I just think of like, there's this Freakonomics about like this guy who won game shows, and it was like about lying. And it was the same thing of like, who are the people who've done like the big studies and get the p-values and everything. But it really seemed to come down to this guy kept winning game shows, or he won at least this one game show by lying. He would lie what he was going to do because he knew that everyone was lying to him. And he would lie, but like it was like a prisoner's dilemma kind of show where, everyone, if, your best outcome statistically is just screw the other person, and then everyone wins a little something. And so this guy would just lie. No, I'm going to do this. And then everyone else would tell these like elaborate lies. And they'd ask them, why'd you tell these stories? Like they're patently not true. And they're like, I don't even know. I just was lying and lying. And then in the end, they realized this guy was so like, didn't care that they engaged in the appropriate, what we'd consider like the appropriate or honest behavior. And he did too. Yeah. So everyone lied to everybody, and then everybody won. So if anybody had actually told the truth, everyone would have lost, and that's a very specific, I think it was like British game show situation, but those situations occur a lot in real life where telling the truth isn't valuable. Yeah.
Right? Is that maybe
what
you're getting at, is like when one should lie, when one should tell the truth. It's really complicated. And as you said, there's a lot of conditional discriminations involved. It's hard to know sometimes or anticipate what the outcome is going to be. And so additionally, if you are not as good at reading social cues, then it can just be a whole quagmire of trying to determine when it's okay to lie and when am I supposed to be telling the truth and why am I bothering telling this little white lie, which kind of like goes against my integrity just for the benefit of, something that seems obscure or some obscure social rule, right? Like it's just really complex when people lie. My only
and sometimes it's not. I've received some guff from saying this out loud before in a talk at a conference or something where I what you're saying is that there are socially valid contexts for lying, right? That telling a lie in that context is potentially acceptable. Maybe depends on who you ask. I don't know, but in terms of the direct consumers, so to speak, of what we're doing, there might be contexts in which telling a lie is a socially valid behavior that's acceptable.
Or it's a neurotypical valued behavior, right?
Well, there's also those kinds of aspects. Yeah, I don't know. So it goes back to what I'm saying about, I think we need more behavior analysts, because one of the things that we do best is study the idiosyncrasies to death until we get
do love
more.
That.
Yeah, we study the hell out of the individual. And then ideally, when we've learned enough about individuals, things can kind of trickle up into more analyses of large scale questions. But psychology generally operates the other way, right? Not even the other way. They generally don't study the individual or the idiosyncrasies. Or when they do study idiosyncrasies, they lump people together based on demographic characteristics, assuming that they're monolithic, right? Like it assumes like, oh, well, if you have a diagnosis of autism, we're going to put you in this group. And if you don't have a diagnosis, we're going to put you in this other group. And now we're going to do some kind of study and make comparisons. But that's assuming that diagnostic label is monolithic for all those people. Right. And so that goes back to what I'm saying about, social validity to me is a question to be asked at the individual level, because there are so many nuances, or at least to start there.
Yeah.
I have a hard time thinking about what kind of group questions I would ever want to know in this context, to be honest. I think it's the idiosyncrasies that are most interesting. And that's what you guys are saying too, is that it's so context dependent and history dependent and all that. Yes, it absolutely is, which is why I think we need more behavior analytic work there.
Yeah. Well, I'd be lying if I said that we answered all the questions we needed to know. But I think these two articles are an excellent way to start looking at lying behavior. And there is a lot more. And hopefully some folks are going to continue kind of asking these questions and studying this very interesting. I don't want to say fascinating because it makes it sound like, oh, lying, what a great behavior we all should do more of, right? But just really interesting phenomenon of lying behavior. And Dr. Corey Stocco, thank you so much for kind of galvanizing this conversation today.
Thanks for having me. I throw out there too, if anybody wants to talk, if anybody's thinking about doing a dissertation or thesis and they want to bounce ideas, I'd be happy to be a part of that awesome. And have some conversations. I'm at a point in my life where I'm not doing as much research. I've kind of moved away from that area. But I'd be happy to be a part of conversations to get something going.
And Corey, where would be the best place for folks to get in touch with you?
My email address is my Corey.Stocco, so corey.stocco at isd917.org, Intermediate School District 917.
Big thanks once again to Dr. Corey Stocco for coming on the show. Again, if you are interested in doing some research on lying yourself, please do reach out to Corey. He's got a lot of information to share, and there are a lot of lying research questions that still need answering. But before we wrap up, let's do our last segment, pairings. Take it away, Diana.
All right, it's time for pairings. Pairings is a section of the show where I tell you about past episodes that you might want to go check out if you found this conversation interesting. And so we have a few that you could go check out for yourself. They include episode 112, where we talked about lying the first time around. Mm-hmm. I don't know what this episode title will be compared to that one, but it was called Lying Behavior. Episode 127, we talk about perspective taking. You can sort of imagine why that would be included. Episode 167 is when we talked about bullying, and I feel like there could be potentially some overlap here in terms of the types of conversations we had there. You know, when is one the bully or the bully
victim?
Yeah, that's the word, victim, right? And the same thing here. Like there's times where one might be the liar or et cetera. So there's that. There's episode 189, self-control. And then finally, we referenced episode 67 and 68, which is a two-parter on the Power of Positive Parenting book. So feel free to go check out any of those.
Which we do love, but I feel like I kind of gave a razzing to slightly in the episode.
It's a really good book. I mean, the book is older now,
yes.
Right? And so that is where that is coming from a little bit, but you should go check it out and probably check out the book because it's a cool book.
It's a great one.
Finally, I also like to recommend a snack to go with the episode as well. So this weekend, we have had a lovely weekend. We've been hanging out with your brother and his wife and just having like a nice fall time. It's been like a fabulous fall weekend. And so we had two special things that we enjoyed this weekend. One was a caramel apple cocktail that I don't even actually know what was in that thing, but it had apple cider in it and like a caramel vodka perhaps in it. Do you know what was in this drink?
I want to say it was like a caramel brandy.
Oh my goodness.
Some vodka.
Yes. And it was delicious. So
you don't want to talk about the variety of pumpkin beers that we sampled?
Well, that was the thing that really stuck out in my mind.
Okay.
So you're going to save that part for the behaviorist. Okay. And then also a tiramisu cake too, because there's a birthday that we're celebrating as well. So both of those are delicious fall related snacks for you to enjoy.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks, Diana.
Oh, you're welcome.
And with that, the end of the show. We hope you enjoyed this episode. A few last things that we want to mention. Certainly thanks to you. If you haven't, please think about subscribing to the show. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can find us online everywhere as ABA Inside Track. Certainly our website, abainsidetrack.com, is a great place to find links to our previous episodes as well as to all of the research that we discuss in these episodes. And you can also purchase CEs there. But stop. Don't do that without knowing all of the secret code words. I'm going to give you the second one for this episode. It is Timberwolves. Timberwolves. It's a type of animal, but it is also a basketball team, which is where Dr. Stocco decided it would be a good fit for this episode. Timberwolves.
It's not a type of shoe.
That's a Timberland.
Right, but it's a Timberwolf.
Yes, Timberwolves. Some final thank yous. Oh, actually, some final plugs for the show. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, why not check us out on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can find a chance to get all of our episodes a week ahead of time, where you can get free CEs for subscribing. And depending on your level, at the $5 or $10 level, you can get access to our listener choice polls and episodes for free CEs and some bonus behind the scenes content, as well as our quarterly book clubs. We have our latest one, should be coming out pretty soon to when this episode is coming out, on The Science of Consequences by Dr. Susan Schneider. So if you want to hear that this in 2024, as opposed to waiting until next year, you can subscribe at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and get some free CEs for thanks from us. And speaking of thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. None of those are lies. That's all very honest truth and praise. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.